Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Business Unusual Lessons from High-Growth CMOs. I'm your moderator, Zoe Fernandez. Before I introduce our speaker and we get to the webinar content, I'd like to share some information about the Dentsu Aegis Network as well as some key housekeeping items for you to keep in mind throughout today's presentation. Please note that the audio for the presentation is streamed live through your computer speakers. Please ask questions throughout the webinar as we'd love to hear from you. We'll dedicate the last 10 minutes of our time here today to get into as many of your questions as possible. To ask a question, please submit them by clicking on the Q&A icon on your screen, entering your question and hit send. If we don't get to your question during today's webinar, we will email you a response in the coming days. You can download a copy of today's CMO Survey report by clicking on the link on the right-hand side of your screen, plus check out the resources related to this webinar, which can be found on the left-hand side of your screen. The Dentsu Aegis Network is a global network of 24 entrepreneurial agencies, purpose-built for the digital economy. Across the world, our 20,000 employees power growth for brands and transform businesses. Our mission is to innovate the ways brands are built. In today's world, that means connecting with people, not just as consumers. We help clients win, keep, and grow their best customers. Our clients include category leaders, disruptive challengers, and innovative startups. The members of the network family are best-in-class agency partners that provide solutions for all parts of the customer journey. As a collaborative network, our agencies combine forces and expertise to tackle larger business challenges and deliver bespoke integrated solutions. To lead today's webinar, we are joined by Dirk Herbert, Chief Strategy Officer at Dentsu Aegis Network, US. Over to you, Dirk.
Thank you so much, and thank you for everyone attending the webcast and spending time with us today. We wanted to take you through a readout of our CMO survey that Dentsu Aegis Network now runs annually, and some of the findings that we had, both looking at how US CMOs stack up against their global counterparts, as well as some specific findings that we drew by looking at high growth versus low growth CMOs to understand what the former is doing differently in order to drive success for the company. Before we go into the data, we wanted to give you a quick overview of the survey methodology. As I said, this is data from the second annual CMO survey that Dentsu Aegis Network has fielded. It is now an annual event. The survey was fielded across 10 different markets, representing a range of company sizes and a range of different industries. First thing that we wanted to do is just kind of benchmark how do US CMOs compare and rank or rate in terms of the broader global context of their global peers. As it turns out, US CMOs very much agree with their global counterparts that marketing must become a leader of transformation of innovation. 81% of US CMOs believe they must transform, not just optimize their business through digital, versus 97% of global folks, so not that much of a difference there. And 79% believe they must take responsibility for product and service innovation, reflecting what we'll touch on a little bit later, the evolution of marketing leaders from traditional branding communication stewards to really chief growth officers who have a much broader remit that includes product and service innovation, and that is reflected in the survey here as well. The interesting thing is, while US CMOs believe in this notion of being drivers of transformation, it might not necessarily manifest itself as business disruption. When we talk to CMOs about whether business disruption is one of their current top 3 roles, only 26% of US CMOs answered in the affirmative, which is lower than the global average. And even looking forward, only 30% of US CMOs said that business disruption per se is among the top 3 priorities versus 36% at the global level. What that indicates to us is that a lot of CMOs, and you will see that particularly represented in high-growth CMOs, are taking more of an evolutionary kind of approach. It's less about completely upending the apple cart and really building on strengths and evolving them with a modern set of tools, which I think is an interesting approach and an interesting finding. So more of an evolution rather than complete revolution approach at this point in time. US CMOs see transformation powered by a greater focus on the consumer. When we looked at the current role of the marketing function within the organization, US CMOs, more so than their global counterparts, said that developing the overall customer experience and understanding consumer and market trends is a key priority. And again, this is a theme, this notion of truly putting the customer at the center and building experience around that you will see reflected through the rest of the presentation as well. The interesting thing is also that US CMOs seem to be on the vanguard of marketers recognizing that there is a shift happening from marketing to mattering, from marketing at consumers as just transactional buyers of products to mattering to people as individuals and members of communities. The U.S. is second only to China in their overall agreement that associating our brand with a social purpose will be critical to engaging consumers going forward. So interesting finding, and nice to see that the U.S. is out up front. The rest of the world will be catching up, although we're really curious about what's going on in China because they're certainly the clear leader in this. Part of that could be that China obviously has the luxury of a recently developed economy to sort of leapfrog and build on the findings from the more developed world of what modern consumers really want and then being able to build that into their marketing priorities. One of the things that marketers have always struggled with is data, and that is reflected in this year's survey as well, although a shift has occurred. In the past, when we talked to marketers, their struggle was with getting their hands on data in the first place. What that has been replaced by is now that a lot of marketers have access to data, the key issue is how to extract value out of the data. 54%, significantly more than their global counterparts of US CMOs agree that while they have invested in technology to collect customer data, they struggle to turn it into business value. And at the core of the struggle of turning it into business value is the fact that 43% of US CMOs are struggling with the fact of extracting insight out of what they now consider to be almost an overwhelming wealth of data. So access to data has been replaced by the challenge of extracting insight from data, which, by the way, was also a theme at this year's ANA Masters of Marketing Conference in Orlando, with a notion of insight and data and turning it into a competitive advantage was one of the key themes that sort of was woven through a lot of the different speeches of CMOs showcasing their efforts at that conference. US CMOs aim to assess strategic impact long-term. 54% of US CMOs say long-term brand health is a key metric in their current role, more so than the 44% of global counterparts. That said, let's not get too excited because in general, US CMOs give themselves a relative short planning cycle. Most CMOs, the average year, plan about 2.3 years ahead, which is below the global average, speaks to the fact that I think in the U.S., and we know that from conversations over the past several years, it was very much a focus on performance marketing and short-term results, and that's something that I think still has repercussions. Although, again, referencing what we saw at the ANA this year, there is a reawakening of investing in brand value, in loyalty, in creativity, and establishing more of a long-term roadmap for a brand rather than this purely transaction-focused effort that a lot of brands have been leaning into over the last several years. One possible reason for the shorter planning cycles is the pressure to deliver growth through short-term gains. 69% of US CMOs agree that they will be under greater pressure to demonstrate tangible short-term results. So again, that is correlated to the relatively short long-term planning cycle of 2.3 years, but at least the numbers seem to be moving up. So overall, the takeaway from this section is that modern CMOs really struggle to balance a number of competing priorities. What we just read out is, I think, the struggle between the need to be agile, move fast, and drive short-term results, balancing that with the view and a demand to create long-term brand value. The notion of, on the one hand, planning ahead and taking a longer view, while at the same time truly being grounded in insight. And if you look through our Make Change Real CMO report, you will see that there are additional issues that CMOs struggle to balance. The notion of leaning further into creativity and actually redefining what creativity is in an effort to more effectively engage consumers in an ever more competitive marketing context, while at the same time ensuring consistency of the brand and its manifestation across experiences. The notion of being open to broader participation of consumers in the brand in and of itself, while at the same time maintaining a measure of control to drive and shift and guide the future of the brand. And the notion of, on the one hand, being asked by consumers to be more purpose-driven, but doing it in a way that at the same time seems authentic and connected to the brand rather than just a marketing veneer. Having finished the look at how US CMOs compare to their global counterparts, we now wanted to take more of a look and shine a light on the difference that we saw coming out of our survey when we compared CMOs in high-growth companies that saw revenue growth versus CMOs that saw stagnation or actually a decline in revenue. Growth is obviously the overall mandate for all CMOs. In that context, we saw the CMO role shifting. We know that across industries, 2018 and actually 2019 saw companies oftentimes actually parting ways with their CMOs or eliminating the role completely. That then was in the context of the CMO role sort of giving birth to this new type of marketing leader with the broader remit that we talked about earlier, folks that are not just in charge of being brand and communications platform stewards, but people who are chief growth officers, chief experience officers, chief commercial officers, oftentimes a new breed of marketing leader with real P&L responsibility that extends across brand and communications into innovation, into new product development, into experience design, into retail, into distribution strategy. So in that context, we then drilled down to figure out what are high-growth CMOs doing differently, what sets their behaviors, priorities, and vision apart. And as we did so, three areas emerged. One was around setting a clear role. Second one was around their strategic vision, and the third one was around the ways that they adapt to consumers. Let's go into the first one, which is about setting a clear role. What we saw here is that high-growth CMOs view understanding and applying consumer data as central to modern marketing. When you look at the chart on the screen, which reflects the primary role of the marketing function as reported by high and low growth CMOs, there is a much greater emphasis among high growth CMOs on understanding market trends and developing the overall customer experience. And actually, if you look at the rating of the number one rated one, delivering business growth, it's very close to the 60% rating of understanding market trends and the 59% of developing the overall customer experience. So for high-growth CMOs, it seems to be the case that they understand that delivering business growth is intimately connected to customer centricity and the delivery of more compelling consumer experiences. There seems to be more of a disconnect for low-growth CMOs who on the one hand say that delivering business growth is very much a priority, but for whom that seems to be disconnected, or not completely, but more so, from the notion of customer centricity and the overall customer experience. Actually, what low growth seem to be sort of banking on is what we're seeing on the next slide. This is where we talk to CMOs about what they see their primary role not being today, not today, but 2 to 3 years time out. And the really interesting finding that you will see on the right-hand side is that the notion of leading disruptive innovation is something that seems to be a high priority for low-growth CMOs, which seems to sort of reflect the mindset that in order to move from they currently are to where they need to grow is really more a revolution rather than an evolution. High-growth CMOs seem to take a very, very different kind of approach. Their primary role priorities for this year versus 2 to 3 years out is very, very consistent. So for them, it's about gradually building on back-to-basic strengths and using modern tools to deliver that, again, including the understanding of consumer and market trends and the overall experience. Experience design does seem to be something that low-growth CMOs see as a priority in the future. It's certainly not something that they're doing now. Again, they seem to forgo customer experience investment for the hope that they can lead truly disruptive innovation at the product level, at the service level. A very, very different kind of approach. Certainly transformation is something that both of these high growth and low growth CMOs are pursuing. But again, sort of steady wins the race seems to be the mantra of the high growth CMOs, and it's reflected in the business results that they seem to be producing. So just banking on disruption and innovation as sort of the key pillar for growth might not be the best thing to do. It needs to be surrounded by other efforts to make growth happen. There's also a difference in terms of how high and low growth CMOs think about evolving capabilities with priorities and vision. What you see on the right versus left-hand side is that high growth CMOs have a much stronger and much more pronounced convictions on what their true priorities are. All of their key priorities are somewhere at the 90 to 93% level, whereas low growth CMOs seem to be hedging their bets a little bit more, with numbers really sort of being in the high 60s to mid 70s. The other interesting thing is that the conviction of the high growth CMOs around what the true priorities are seems to have led them to invest in capabilities that deliver against that. The gap between what the aspiration of a high growth CMO is and the capabilities needed to deliver that is significantly smaller for those that are driving growth in their companies versus those that are struggling with that, right? You see for low growth CMOs, the gap between the priority and the actual capability is oftentimes, 60 percentage points, very, very different from high growth CMOs. So high growth drivers seem to have stronger convictions and therefore drive smarter and more focused investments around capabilities that let them deliver against those priorities. One of the things, actually, I should go back, rushed a little bit here. One of the things that both low and high growth CMOs are focused on is the notion of data collection, management, and analytics that drives real consumer insight. In that kind of context, it was interesting to us that, again, there's a difference between high and low growth CMOs. 73% of high growth CMOs said that extracting insight from consumer data requires wider skills than data science. So it's not just purely an operational number crunching exercise. That number of 73% for positive growth CMOs compares to only 33% of low growth CMOs making the same statement. So again, for high growth CMOs, there is an understanding that leveraging data, activating data in terms of extracting insight and then driving it in a way that can propel real business value takes a multidisciplinary team coming together rather than just being an analytics exercise. And this notion of bringing multiple elements of the organization together, again, is a theme that you will see a little later on in the presentation as something that sets high growth CMOs apart from low growth CMOs. The other thing that's different between the two TAMs, high versus low growth, is that high growth CMOs seem to take responsibility for a broader set of metrics and holding themselves against that. High growth CMOs consistently rate all elements that we probe them on, from growth of customer base to long-term brand health, reducing costs, product service innovation, short-term sales, and delivery of digital transformation programs as priorities that they need to drive and that business should hold them accountable for. When we look at low-growth CMOs, they tend to have more focus areas. One, again, is product and service innovation, which we saw on previous slides, as well as growth of the customer base, but they seem to have lower expectations of themselves when it comes to accountability for some of the other metrics. So again, high-growth CMOs bringing a more holistic vision and set of accountabilities to the table to drive success for their business. So our takeaway from that section around the notion of high-growth CMOs setting a clear role was that those CMOs balance data and creative capabilities to deliver on the holistic customer experience, much more well-rounded view and well-rounded set of accountabilities. As the role of marketing is evolving, high-growth CMOs stake out strong priorities and invest to deliver against them, clear focus and investment behind it, while low-growth CMOs are still putting basics like data collection and CRM in place to enable basic consumer connections. Moving on to the strategic vision. This goes back to how far out do different CMO types plan. What we see here is that high-growth CMOs outplan both the global average and the U.S. average. High-growth CMOs plan about, on average, 2.7 years out, which is significantly longer than low-growth CMOs who at this point basically look ahead about a year and a half, 1.7 years, probably very much driven by a more performance marketing, the need to deliver short-term results kind of focus. What high-growth CMOs are also doing well is communicating the value of long-term planning and long-term brand building in more effective ways versus their low-growth counterparts. While 67% of high-growth CMOs do admit that they will be under pressure to demonstrate tangible short-term results, that is significantly lower than the almost 80% of low-growth CMOs who seem to have a much, much greater mandate to produce results now, which oftentimes distracts from taking the longer-term view and investing for long-term brand health. High-growth CMOs are also more likely to feel a sense of urgency around digital transformation. When we ask them, do you agree that you will need to transform your business through digital technologies, not just optimize it, so significantly move it forward rather than just sort of incremental changes? 86% of high-growth CMOs agreed with that statement versus 67% of low-growth CMOs. So again, a greater understanding of the need for transformation, which again might not necessarily be complete disruption, but making strides, not just incremental improvements. What is interesting, and I mentioned about this before, is the high-growth CMO capability to start to bring multiple parts of the organization together and align it around a common vision. When we look at the challenges that CMOs face, low-growth CMOs seem to be much more challenged with internal factors, lack of internal talent, and competing agendas with other C-suite leaders. When we look at high-growth CMOs on the left-hand side, that is not the case. Their challenges are more externally focused, meaning how do we better connect with consumers, understand what they want, and then use that as inputs to transform brand behavior rather than transforming consumer behavior. It's about lack of integration across all elements of the customer journey, so this notion of more consistency in delivering experiences grounded in a clear vision. There is conversations among high-growth CMOs around getting greater control to actually be able to make the investments that they know that they need to make to better connect and service consumers. And there's certainly the challenge on how quickly they can transform. So the notion of agility is something that comes through here. But overall, they seem to have done a much better job of aligning the entire organization behind marketing priorities and helping that business understand how the marketing strategy connects to and supports the business strategy, something that low-growth CMOs are struggling with. High-growth CMOs have the support of their organization, which recognizes the importance of customer experience. When we talk to CMOs, whether they're investing in customer experience next year, 97% of high-growth CMOs answered in the affirmative, again, confirming a lot of the other trends that we saw early in the deck, versus 78% of low or no-growth CMOs. So the lessons learned here is that high-growth CMOs enable marketing to play a more cross-functional role and flex with shifting consumer expectations by addressing their organization's culture. The notion of bringing the organization together, multiple parts, different departments, and aligning them around a common vision. Low-growth CMOs face challenges to align their agenda with the business and fellow C-suite. Without that foundation, they have not been able to focus on long-term planning or consumer-facing initiatives. They struggle with internal feuds rather than being able to align the resources of their company behind the best possible expression towards consumers. The final one is about adapting to consumers. We know that CMOs of organizations experiencing decline take more of an operational approach to the customer experience versus high-growth CMOs. This reflects something that we talked about a little bit earlier. When you look at the blue bars, which represents the priorities of high-growth CMOs, you see that they have a much more consistent set of responsibilities and feel they have a much broader remit in terms of how to define a good customer experience. For low-growth CMOs, it's about a consistent product or service and delivering that service through all touch points. High-growth CMOs go way beyond that. Leaning into brand loyalty, leaning into creating emotional connection with the brand, which, by the way, was a huge theme at the ANA this year. The whole idea of using emotion as a way to connect with consumers, build deeper relationships, not just treating customers as transactional objects, but connecting with people as individuals and consumers, very much reflected here and reflected in the priorities of high-growth CMOs. Responsiveness to feedback, agility to drive change, smoother points of transaction, and unified commerce. So again, high-growth CMOs very much leading the charge in re-envisioning what it means to deliver a customer experience, which no longer is grounded in a product or a service, but includes a lot of other, oftentimes intangible aspects that the brand can and should deliver that low-growth CMOs are currently not focusing on. I think I actually just recently saw data that said that 80% of consumers agree that the overall experience is as, if not more important, than the actual product that a marketer or a brand delivers. The notion of having a product that does what it's supposed to do at this point is becoming cost of entry for a relationship with consumers. To maintain that, build a deeper relationship and build loyalty, the overall experience is absolutely crucial, and high-growth CMOs are leaning into it. High-growth CMOs are also recognizing that modern consumers have significantly higher expectations of brands. 84% say that associating our brand with a social purpose will be critical to engaging consumers versus only 56% of low-growth CMOs. You know, in an age where we know consumers expect brands to inspire them, to support their life and ambition, and increasingly actually drive social change, the idea of marketers reimagining what's at the core of the brand and tying it more closely to either a passion point or a broader social purpose is absolutely crucial. And again, for those of you who attended the ANA or happened to read articles and summaries of what happened there, this was a major, major theme. The notion of re-articulating what your brand is all about from a transactional to more of an emotional, value, purpose-driven relationship, especially crucial at a time where brands are no longer built from the advertising down, but from the experience up, and then using purpose and how the brand connects to that as the foundational platform that then informs all of the touch points of experience design. Finally, a really interesting finding here in terms of how high versus low growth CMOs approach the coming data protection legislation. 73% of high growth CMOs agree that the upcoming legislation is not so much a threat, but actually represents an opportunity to build trust, whereas only 22% of low growth CMOs agree with that statement. So at a time where consumers expect personalized communications and actually make it a benchmark for what brands to engage with and what brands to walk away from, while at the same time developing a much greater understanding and awareness of how brands are using their, meaning consumers' data, and having concerns about privacy and protection, this to me is a really interesting way to look at the world. This idea that data protection legislation is not so much a threat to marketers, but a new chance for marketers to build trust, to evidence what we call respect for consumers, to be more meaningful in selecting the data that is being collected, ensuring that what's being collected about consumers actually can be converted into value by delivering a better, more tailored, or more valuable service, rather than being threatened by this kind of legislation. So really interesting stuff. And then wrapping it up in the lessons learned. We've seen that there's a shift happening from changing consumer behavior to changing marketing behavior to meet consumer expectations. We actually believe that that is the fundamental transition that marketing as a discipline is now. As we moved from a brand-led world where the focus was on changing consumer behavior, and if you think about every creative brief that you've ever written, it is a brief to change consumer behavior. Now that we live in a world that is consumer-led, defined by opt-in culture and choice, the role of marketing can no longer be just changing consumer behavior. The role of marketing needs to become changing brand behaviors, for brands to evolve and adjust to changing consumer needs, and hopefully not just meet them, but anticipate where they're going next, which, by the way, I think is also an interesting takeaway for how marketing and advertising agencies should re-envision their roles, worry less about changing consumer behavior, think more about what you can do as an agent of change and transformation for your clients and their internal organization. Sorry to go off on a little rant here, but I think that's a big point to make. We also saw that high-growth CMOs define customer experience across the entire journey rather than thinking of it just in terms of the product and the immediacy around the product, and that low-growth CMOs must recognize the impact of soft drivers of growth, such as emotional connections and loyalty, as well as convince the organization of that value. So the overall conclusions are, at the core of what high-growth CMOs are doing really well is this notion that they're achieving business transformation through marketing integration. They're driving growth, have created an integrated role for their department, balancing performance with brand health. They view marketing at the heart of customer-led business transformation. High-growth CMOs teach us that an organizational internal culture is key to driving growth. Integration must happen on two levels, aligning the organization around marketing priorities and vision, and integrating the marketing strategy into the business strategy, or at least getting alignment of the business around the marketing strategy. And finally, modern CMOs realize that success demands marketing integrate into consumers' lives. The notion of moving from an interruption to integration and intersection. Customer experience is now the entire journey, not just parts of it, offering new challenges, but also great new opportunities for marketers to connect with consumers on a deeper, more personal, and yes, emotional level. And yes, there will be a transaction as well. So that's it for the presentation today, taking a look at the readout of our annual CMO survey, benchmarking US CMOs against their global counterparts, as well as taking more of a lens towards what our high-growth CMOs do differently in contrast to low-growth CMOs. And that's it.
Thank you, Dirk. First of all, thanks for sharing today's presentation. There was a lot of great insights throughout the content, so thank you for that. It looks like we've received several questions. Just as a reminder, if you do have any additional questions, please submit them through the Q&A icon on your screen. So let's get to some of those now. So the first question, how will the role of the CMO evolve in the next 3 years? What do you think the title will be?
Yeah, I think this is something that we touched on in the early part of the deck. We are definitely seeing a transformation occurring. And while it wasn't an explicit topic at the ANA this year, the way that CMOs talked about the role and how they affected change and drove growth, I think is a reflection of the transformation that is happening. I think what we're seeing is chief marketing officers who tended to have a narrower remit with a focus on being stewards for the brand and communications, and who were building brands from the advertising down, now transforming, in some cases being asked to transform, in some cases being pushed into transformation by their business, and become what we call, chief growth officers. Those are marketing leaders who oftentimes have P&L responsibilities. Yes, they still have responsibility for stewarding brand and communications, but they live in a world where brands are built from the experience up, and to deliver that experience requires a much broader remit and responsibility, from new product development to experience innovation to retail to distribution. So a much, much broader role that these folks are playing, being much, much closer connected to driving revenue and growth and being tied into the gears of the business. I think there's also another transformation that's happening for the modern CMO, which is how do you create an organization that can act in as agile of a way as consumers are evolving their habits, and what they expect from brands. And I think what the new type of CMO, the Chief Growth Officer, will be asked to do, and again, this was something that was discussed more explicitly at the ANA actually, was the idea that the old separation of brand marketing in one corner and performance marketing in the other corner is going away, that we're moving into a world where there only exists brand performance marketing, that the CMO has to, or Chief Growth Officer, I should say, has to be able to balance both of those, that performance marketing alone will only get you so far. At some point, you will exhaust the supply of ready buyers. There needs to be a steady replenishment of people that you bring into the brand's orbit, and it just means balancing both. So it's not an either or, it's balancing both. And that's what we see the role evolving. And again, within that, is then also the change from the chief marketing officer in charge of brand and comms, whose aim was to change consumer behavior, trying to convince customers to act in ways that were beneficial to the brand, to the new chief growth officer, who I believe is a transformational agent for brand behavior. Their focus is on how do I change my own organization to deliver against what customers want, rather than worrying too much about how do I get customers to do what I want. So that would be our answer to that question.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Dirk. And kind of tied to that one, we had a question come in about how CMOs are modernizing their own skill sets in order to keep up with these high growth practices. Are there any best practices or insights you could share, or anything that you heard at last week's ANA conference that can help with this question?
How do they keep their skill set modern? I think it's, there's probably a number of different ways of doing it. I think what I've seen being part of associations like the ANA is fantastic, because you're surrounded by a community of like-minded people who oftentimes face the same challenges. And even for us, as being on the marketing agency side of things, it's just great to see when successful companies read out what worked for them. And by the way, which I love as well, there was plenty of conversation about what hadn't worked well and how companies then sort of course corrected. So I think embedding yourself in a community of like-minded people is really important. I think CMOs should look to their agency and marketing partners as being agents of keeping them abreast of the latest trends, both in terms of what's happening in the economy, what's happening in the industry, what's happening with the competition, what's happening with culture, what's happening with ad tech, martech. There's a whole range of topics I think that agencies are well suited to be both informers as well as catalysts of change. I think other things that for me always spark inspiration is looking at and immersing myself more into the winners from various award ceremonies. You know, some obviously are more creatively driven, but then you have the Epis, where it's really about marketing effectiveness and looking at and actually reading into the case studies and sort of identifying key trends of what makes for a truly effective campaign. You can actually do it by industry vertical. You can do it by marketing deliverable. I found that to be a great way to drive learnings. And then, you know, there's obviously just keeping up with reading and sort of having a news feed that brings you information about the industry, about competitors, about technology. And while sometimes it can be tough to keep up with, and usually when I come in the morning, I have 20 emails that I first have to move into my future reading list folder from my various news lists. Those are the ways that I think we stay up to date and inform our thinking.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for sharing those insights, Dirk. Another question that's come in, what are the current trends marketers should be aware of as they look to better connect with today's consumers?
I think we would sort of look at three things. One is the whole tension around data and data privacy. I think that will continue to be an issue. We've talked about that a little bit. We know that consumers respond to personalized, contextual, and relevant experiences, communications, and products. There's almost now an expectation among consumers that personalization will happen. I think I saw a stat, can't source it right now, but 50% or more of consumers have actually abandoned a brand because it did not deliver a more personalized experience. So on the one hand, it's something that's expected. On the other hand, consumers want to know how their data is being used, greater transparency around that, greater control, and trust that the data is being protected. Again, we see an opportunity for brands to lean into that as a way to connect with consumers and build deeper relationships rather than being afraid of that. I think what a lot of the new privacy regulation will ultimately force marketers to do is be more discerning in what data is being collected. I think what has happened over the last couple of years is that any data you could get your hands on as a marketer was just sucked in, and it's now sitting in a database, which connects to a data point that we have, that half of marketers are saying, yeah, we got tons of data, but we actually can't extract insight out of it. We're so overwhelmed by it. So being more choiceful and only collect the data that leads to real value, I think is going to be interesting. And sort of walking that balancing act. How are you, as a marketer, a responsible user of data, but then also how do you activate it to better connect with consumer is one of those topics. The other one is purpose, the notion of reimagining brand platforms to move away from the traditional product and transaction focus to understanding that your brand probably has a broader purpose in a consumer's life. It doesn't have to be, you know, sustainability or some kind of social purpose, but there usually should be an understanding that a brand is bigger than just a transaction. It could be about, you know, better connecting with consumers' passion points, but broadening the remit of what the brand believes they're in business for. You know, the purpose for Dunkin' Donuts, according to their CMO from the AMA, is to refuel optimism, right? That's the business that they see themselves being in, and it then just happens to be manifested through the very delicious products and services that they're providing. But again, an example of how brands are taking a broader view of what they do and then making that the foundation for how you design experience We talked about that modern brands are built from the experience up. I think that is a great way to think about what marketers need to do. Yes, there will be communications and an external expression of what we're ultimately all about, but start with what you stand for, build the experience ecosystem and products that deliver against that promise, and then build communications on top of that that bring to life the proof points that you now have established. So I think a very different way to build brands than the old advertising down model. And the third one we touched on a little bit is customer experience. Being more focused or as focused on what is the experience for consumers, how do you engage them, how do you activate them, how do you convert them, transact with them, and retain them. Thinking about experience across the entire customer journey, not just in individual segments, and making it more connected. I also would say that the fourth one, which we didn't bring up here, but I think is also really relevant, is the notion that we're moving from a monoculture into a space of ever greater diversity. Diversity, I think, is oftentimes thought about mostly in terms of ethnic diversity, the fact that 51% of Gen Z are now non-Caucasian whites, and that is a big factor, I think, to think through and figure out how marketers respond to that. But we also have broader social diversity. There's just a much greater explosion that's happening in our cultural and social and demographic life in America, and the understanding that necessitates that we move from the old model where we thought about audiences built around averages and instead move to thinking about individual communities that are tied together by common priorities, whether that's, a passion point around music or sports, or around more of a social purpose, gender equality kind of driven thing, whether it's about, gamers or something along those lines. But I think that is a big shift that is occurring, and marketers need to lean in more with more gusto. Less planning around averages, more planning around communities and the individuals within that. So those are some of the things that I would throw out as things that are on our radar.
Great, thank you, Dirk. Let's see, we've got time for one last question here. So as pressure for short-term performance builds, how can marketers quantify and make the case for positive impact of brand building and creativity?
Yes. That's a nice one and a meaty one. I think one of the steps that we would advocate is be choiceful about what's being measured, right? Instead of measuring everything and anything, set out the right metrics for success. Yes, obviously, it's easier to attach certain metrics to performance-driven marketing, but I think, and again, this came out of the ANA, this notion of being able to connect with consumers on a more emotional level, moving away from interruption to intersecting, and building loyalty. I've seen cases built of how those kind of activities and investment have driven as much or contributed as much to revenue and growth and brand equity building and expanded awareness, consideration, and preference as the more tactically offer-driven performance marketing initiative. So I think it's really understand what to measure, be clear about how to measure it, and then weave it into a story. I think the other thought to keep in mind is that performance without brand, yes, can drive short-term results, but ultimately you will run out of steam. You just end up harvesting the low-hanging fruit, and I think we've seen that again and again. Marketers only rely on short-term performance metrics. Ultimately see the curve flattening. You have the cautionary tale of craft, which discontinued investing in the brand and the disastrous effects it had on that. So brand and performance must work together. And then this notion of don't just market to people, matter to people. This idea that brands succeed not just through transactional relationships, but by building deeper connections, understanding consumers as people. And I think there are a number of ways and business cases and case studies out there that show how that drives business success, loyalty, lower cost of acquisition, larger share of wallet, greater lifetime value. So I think there's a number of metrics out there that marketers can use to help educate their organization that a balance of both brand and performance are needed to thrive in the future.
Great, thank you, Dirk. So as I said, that's all the time we have for questions today. But before we go, I'd like to note a few upcoming webinars that are part of the Dentsu Aegis Network's Live Talk series. The first is Breaking Through the Attention Deficient Economy, being held at 1 p.m. on October the 16th. Next is Experiences with Purpose, How Brands Can Deliver More Meaningful Experiences, which will be on October the 29th at 1 p.m. And then the third in the series is How Media Agencies Will Prevent Brand Extinction. That's been held at 1 p.m. Eastern on November the 14th. There will be a pop-up to register for these webinars at the end of today's presentation. Thank you again to each of you for joining us today, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.